All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Shani and Avram Kelman, dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of the engagement of their son Yechiel to Alana Falik, in memory of their parents Jerome and Bernice Kelman, Alexandra and Federica, David Aleim Zichron L'Brach. We open the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama shall have an Aliyah, and the family a Nechama. To thank Barak, Maya, Sandy Hoffman, Dora Limas, and Avi Malamed for dedicating the Shurim and Drashos this month in honor and memory of Ruvain ben Emmanuel Zichron Livrach. We open the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah, and the family a Nechama. And our Daf Yomi share in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Yehuda ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Matt and Diane Marks, on in celebrating the birth of their grandson Yehuda Yeshaya ben Moshe Elio, to their children Moshe Elia and Sippy Marks in Lakewood. May he grow Meretz Hashem, may Chayil El Chayil do Maisim Tovim, and provide the mishpacha with nachas for many years to come. Mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. We'll say with that, let us begin. So we'll say today's daf is Nun Dalid, but you would not know that based on where we are starting. So Meretz Hashem, we are picking up on Nun Gimel Amud Beis 53b, 14 lines down, but we're going to be all right. We're going to make it. Tomorrow's also a very short daf. Meretz Hashem, so the universe will be back in equilibrium. So we'll see, we are picking up in Meretz Hashem, Amrli Rav Chisda Rav Yosef, 14 lines down from the top, 53b. We actually started this yesterday, but it's a good point of departure for today's shir. Amrli Rav Chisda Rav Yosef, Mishmi Lecha Minid Rav Yehuda. Did you hear anything from Rav Yehuda regarding the following issue? Arusa yesh lo mezonos or ein lo mezonos. Doesn't Arusa have mezonos or doesn't have mezonos? Now, boss, remember again, to reorient ourselves a little bit, we started this yesterday. Remember, what is this dealing with? If you look at Rashi explains Arusa yesh lo mezonos. Rashi explains Arusa yisoma yesh lo mezonos mina achin olo. Remember, we're talking about over here, if a girl is orphaned. So remember again, as we've established, what's the halacha when it comes to an orphaned girl? She is supported by the estate of her deceased father. In other words, even though her brothers are the ones who inherit, she receives support from the estate. The shaila over here is as follows. Now this girl becomes an arusa. So the shaila is, as an arusa, is she still entitled to support from the estate? That's the question. Amrle, he said, Mashmalo Shmir, I suppose to remember again, this is Rav Chisda asking of Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef said, Amrle, Mashmalo Shmirli, the truth is, I never really heard anything explicitly about this, Ela Misvara, but I would say logically, Lesla. I would say logically that once she becomes an Arusa, she's no longer supported by the estate. Why? Kevan di Irsa lo nechale de Tisra. So it's very interesting. Why does she no longer receive support from the estate? Because Bipashtos, once she becomes an Arusa, that means she's connected to this man, to this Arus. The Arus is not going to want her to walk around in a compromised state. So therefore, by definition, once he realizes that she doesn't have a father, he is going to provide support for her. In other words, even though normally an Arusa is not entitled to support from her Arus, in this case, where she is an orphan, the Aros is going to recognize that he doesn't want his Kala to walk around in a compromised state. He's going to support her. Therefore, the estate no longer has an obligation to support her. So Rav Chisda said back, Amrlei, Imashmalo Shmialacha. So now let me get this straight. So you never heard any explicit answer to my question. You're advancing a svara. I would tell you, Misvara Isla, I could argue the opposite way. And I would say that based on logic, that she should be entitled to support from the estate. Why? Because at the end of the day, since the chassan doesn't say any time that there's erisin, right? You never know for sure if the marriage is going to continue forward, right? You never know what's going to happen. Because let me see, he might find some type of mum, he might find some kind of disqualifying factor. She may find some kind of disqualifying factor. he's not going to start spending significant money on her. In other words, it doesn't make sense logically for him to go ahead and spend serious money on her during Erisin, because who knows what could happen? Who knows what he could discover? Who knows what she could discover? So therefore, again, interestingly enough, so Rav Chisda says back to Rav Yosef, if you're saying Misvara, I would say Svara would dictate that the Yisoma would still be supported by the estate. Okay, Amri. So we'll say there's an alternate version of this discussion. Amrle, he said to him, Mashma lo shmieli, I never heard anything explicit about this question, but Misvara Isla. But I would say logically, it's supposed to be an alternate version of the previous discussion. But I would say Misvara, she should be entitled to support from her father's estate. Why? Because since the chassan doesn't know fully if he's going to marry her, in other words, he may discover something that may ultimately void the relationship, he's going to be reluctant to spend significant money on her. Misvara, less like Haven, I'm sorry. So Amar Lei said back to him, Imashma lo shmiya, if you have heard nothing explicit, Misvara less like, it argue just the opposite. Logically, she should not receive anything from the estate. Why? Kevan di irsa lo nichale de tissal. Because halacha l'maisa, since they had erisin, an aros is not going to want his kala to walk around in a compromised state, and therefore bepashtos, he is going to provide her with support. So both say, interestingly enough, the question is clear, the answer is not. Right? So the question is a very interesting one, which is halacha l'maisa. Here's what we've established. A girl, right? We've already established in yesterday's daf that a girl is supported from her deceased father's estate until one of two events occur. What are the two events? Either bagros or marriage. Here's the shaila, but marriage classically means what? Nisuin, because up through Erisin is when she's living in her father's home. Here's the shaila. So she's supported from the estate. What happens during Erisin? That's our question. Or is it, in other words, we know until marriage, or which part of marriage? Is she supported from her father's estate during Erisin or not? So I must say, if you notice, so what's the conclusion of the Gemara? The conclusion of the Gemara is very inconclusive. Right? In other words, the Gemara makes arguments both ways. Interestingly enough, the Rambam Paskins over here, the Rambam says, he says like this, the halacha is hamaaris pas hanizonos mina achen chayv mimzonoseb mishas ha'erisin sharein lo mizonos me'achera ela ad shetis ares. So we'll say the Rambam Paskins that when a girl is being supported from the estate of her father, so mizonos from the estate ends at erisin. That's how the Rambam Paskins. Therefore, from erisin and on, the husband will pick up the support obligation. That's how the Rambam Paskins. Good, let's go back there. Says the Gemara, bo'o minei mirav sheshes. So we'll see some other interesting cases. Bo'o mirav sheshes. Mima'enes, yesh lamazonos, ein lamazonos. Was an interesting case. Remember, we've seen this before. We spoke about, we focused on much in Yavamis. So we'll say, so we know, midaraisa, a father has an ability to marry off his daughter. Okay. Now remember, we also pointed out that let's say the father died. The mother or the brother has the ability also to marry off the daughter. But again, what kind of marriage is it? It's marriage midrabanan. It's marriage midrabanan. So here's vaharaya. If the girl who's in this marriage decides that she wants out, how does she terminate the marriage? She simply refuses. Miyun, that's all. She refuses the marriage and she's out of it. So here's the interesting shaila. So now you have a girl who was married off, let's say, by her brother. Okay, so father's died. She's married off by her brother. She doesn't like the marriage anymore. She refuses. She does miyun. So now what's the shaila? Does she become entitled again to support from the estate? Right? So in other words, does she go back to being supported from the estate or not? So mima enes yesh lamazonos o ein lamazonos. So we learn this. Amona bebeis aviha, ugrusha bebeis aviha, vishomeres yava bebeis aviha. If a girl is an almana in her father's home, in other words, she was widowed, or ultimately, again, she's divorced and she's living in her father's home, vishomeres yavam, or she's waiting yibum in her father's home, yesh la mizonos. Ultimately, again, she is entitled to mizonos. Now, if you look at Rashi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, oda bebeis aviha yesh la mizonos. So what's right? Rabbi Yehuda says, If she's still in her father's home, she has mazonos. If she's not in her father's home, she doesn't have mazonos. Says the Gemara, sounds like they're saying the same thing. That if she's living in her father's home, she's entitled to mazonos. So Yehuda Hanu Tanakama, Elalav Mima Enes Ikabenayu. Narbo say, must see the case of Mima Enes is the nafkamina. The Tanakama Savar Isla. The Tanakama holds that a Mima Enes is entitled to mazonos. Rabbi Yehuda Savar Lesla. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that ultimately, again, a Mima Enes is not entitled to mizonos. So I will say fundamental distinction ultimately between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. So I will say, so again, fundamental machlokes, how do we paskin? So I will say, I just brought these up to you. The Rambam says, it's actually same parak. I didn't quote you before the Marimakom. This is all in Hilchos Ishus, parak Yud Tes. So the previous halacha that we discussed was halacha tes vav. This is halacha yudalis. So listen to this. Bas hamima enes harei kishara banos v'yesh lo mazonos. The Rambam paskins, if a girl does miyun, she is restored back to her father's home, so to speak. Now in this case, the father's dead. She is restored back to the estate, and once again is supported from the estate. Incredible. Bas yivama yesh lo mazonos ein lo mazonos. So it's an interesting case. What about the daughter of the Yavama? So just to understand what happens over here. Reuven was married to Rachel. Switching gears a little bit over here. Reuven's married to Rachel. Reuven's married to Rachel. Reuven dies without children. He dies without children. So Reuven has a brother, right? Rachel does Yibum with Shimon. Rachel and Shimon have a daughter. So I'll say, here's the Shaila. So the Gemara says, so Yivama yesh la mazonos ein la mazonos. Is a Yivama entitled to mizonos or not? So I will say, so now watch this. So the Gemara says as follows. So Bas Yivama, so now again remember, the daughter of the Yivama, is she entitled to mizonos or not? So the Gemara says, Kevin Damar Kesuvos Nichse Baila Harishon. Now remember again, I will say back to our Yivama stays a little bit. Rachel's Kesuva is against whose estate? Rachel's Kesuva is against Reuven's estate, right? Her deceased husband. Remember, Shimon has no obligation of a Kesuva. He has an obligation, but the Kesuva satisfied through Reuven's. So do we say, therefore, again, since Rachel's Kesuva comes from Reuven's estate, therefore Rachel's daughter is supported by Reuven's estate as well. So the Gemara says, given our mark Kesuvos Nichse Baila Harishon Lesla. O Dilma Kevan de is the Lesla Merishon Takino le Rabbanon Misheni. So here's the interesting question. On one hand, you could say, since Rachel's Kesuva, so let's play this out. Rachel's Kesuva comes from Reuven's estate, Reuven, the deceased husband. Now remember, the obligation to support a daughter, Abosai, is what? A Tnai Kesuva, right? Ultimately, again, that is a function of Kesuva. So maybe daughter is supported from the estate. Daughter is supported from the estate that has the obligation of Kesuva. Since Kesuva obligation comes from Reuven's estate, therefore Rachel's daughter, even though her daughter is from who? From Shimon, the Yavam, should be supported from Reuven's estate. On the other hand, and therefore again, she's not entitled to any mazonos from Shimon's estate. On the other hand, what's the halacha if Reuven died and he had no money? Whose estate does Rachel's Kesuva come from? Right? Where does it? Comes from Shimon. So therefore, maybe Shimon has a support obligation, to which the Gemara says, Teku. The Gemara says, ultimately, again, we're not exactly sure about that. The Gemara ends off without answering that. Okay, so they're both say, so that's the last part of this. So let's go back there. Fascinating idea. So we'll say, so I'll just tell you, in this case also, here, I didn't actually quote this. I didn't quote this over here from Mr. Rambam. So the halacha is, Rabbi said, we're going to see that ultimately in this case, where Reuven dies and he does not have an estate, or there is no money, so ultimately support obligation for Rachel's daughter will come from Shimon's estate. So Shimon will ultimately again have the obligation to support his biological daughter. Okay, beautiful. Says go weiter. By Rabbi Lazar. So Rabbi Lazar asked the following shaila: Bas shnia yesh lo mazonos ein lo mazonos. Well, it's an interesting case. Again, a lot of chazar from Yevamis today. Remember, there's a concept of a shnia. Shnia means a erva midrabanan. right? So there's ervas daraisa, and then there are rabbinic ervas. Let's say a man marries a rabbinic erva. Excuse me. A man marries. No, I'm good. I'm fine. Thank you. A man marries a rabbinic erva. Aser, but marriage works. They have a daughter. So bas shnia yesh lo mazonos ein lo mazonos. Ultimately, again, I will say interesting shaila. Is this girl entitled to mazonos or not? So here, she is the product of a rabbinically prohibited marriage. Is she entitled to mazonos? So top of nun dal, we'll say 54a. Kavan the less la ksuva, less la mizone. So we'll say on one hand, remember, if a man marries a shnia, there's no ksuva, which makes sense. Chazal only instituted a ksuva when in a legal marriage. But if you're marrying illegally, there's no ksuva. So on one hand, we could say that since halacha l'maisa, when Reuven marries Rachel, and in this case Rachel is a shnia, so since there's no ksuva, there's also no support obligation for the daughter. Odilma Odilma ima da avda isura kansur rabbanon. Ihi delo avda isura lo kansur rabbanon. I will say, on the other hand, maybe you could say, who did Chazal penalize? Chazal penalized the mother, because the mother did something wrong. She married illegally, but the daughter did nothing illegal, right? The daughter didn't do anything, so maybe she should not be penalized and she should receive mazonos, even though her mother does not have a ksuva, to which the Gemara says, teiku. Gemara leaves it open. Bayrava. I'll raise the kasha. Basarusa yesh la mazonos ein la mazonos. So here's an interesting case. The daughter of an arusa. And I will say, how exactly do you have the daughter of an arusa? So it's a simple case. Chassan and Kala clearly spent a bit too much time together. Right? So I will say, so in this case over here, right, Reuven and Rachel. Now again, they're married. They had Erisin. They jumped the gun a little bit, right? They had Erisin, and now they have a child during Erisin. So I will say, interesting shaila. So ultimately, again, so Reuven and Rachel married. They have a daughter. Is daughter entitled to mazonos during Erisin or not? So on one hand, Kivan de Isla Ksuva Isla Isla. So I will say, on one hand, interestingly enough, since Rachel has a Ksuva, maybe the daughter has mazonos. So what does it mean Rachel has a Ksuva? Look at Rashi. Kivan de Isla Ksuva, Kivan Kigon Shekasavla Mina Erisin, Inami Rabbanan Taku Nami Larusa. I will say, I just want to point out something interesting, because we see this back and forth a little bit, which is you see this little bit of ambiguity in the Gemara as to at what point in time does a husband have an obligation for ksuva. Now the truth is, I already showed you the Rambam on this and the Shulchan Aruch, and the Rambam Shulchan Aruch paskin that halacha l'maisa, the obligation for a ksuva doesn't begin until nisuin. That's how they paskin. Even though that's how they paskin, the Gemara clearly goes back and forth with this yisod and identifies. So Rashi says, maybe we're talking about a case where a husband obligated himself in ksuva as of erisin, or no, maybe the core obligation for ksuva does exist as of erisin. So on one hand, maybe we say, since there's some type of ksuva obligation by erisin, therefore there's a chiyuv mizonos. So the Gemara says, oh Dilma, Kevan delota kino l'rabbanan ksuva ad shas nisuin lesla. Or maybe not. Maybe ksuva doesn't really apply up until nisuin, and therefore ultimately again there's no obligation of support. Teiku. So we'll say the Gemara once again says teiku. Good. So by Rav Papa, another kasha. Rav Papa asked the following: Anusa yesh lamazonos ein lamazonos. We'll say a very interesting case. Let's say a man violates a woman. Reuven violates Rachel. They have a daughter. So now is Reuven obligated in the support of this daughter? To which the Gemara says, well, let's analyze. So the Gemara says, Ali b'd Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, lo tibay lecha, damar yesh la ksuva mana. So it's according to Rabbi Yossi, that's not a shayla, because Rabbi Yossi Yehuda holds, and also remember again, what's talacha when a man violates a woman? What's talacha? So remember again, we did this sugi, we spent a lot of time on this. So first of all, there's multiple forms of repayment, right? There's knas, there's sheves, there's ripui, there's boshes, and there's also an obligation to marry her, right? There's also, the only people who could object to the marriage are the woman herself or her father, right? The violator cannot. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda holds there is also a ksuva. He's obligated in ksuva to her. So therefore, what's contrary to Rabbi Yehuda? Obviously, since there's a ksuva, that also means that he has an obligation to what? To support the daughter. Support the daughter. So kiti ba'ilachali b'dirabanan. The amri yotze kesef knasa b'ksuvasa. They both say the shayla is according to the Rabbanon. Now the Rabbanon hold that halacha lamaisa there is no ksuva. The Rabbanon hold that the penalty payment is in lieu of a ksuva. So Rabbi say, so according to them, here's the shaila. So what do we say? Kevan de les la ksuva, les la mazone. So do we say that since there's no ksuva, therefore violator Ruvain has no support obligation towards his daughter? O Dilma ksuva taimamai. Rabbi say, why did Chazal institute a ksuva? We actually never explicitly articulated this, but it is interesting to point out. We'll say ultimately, actually, I'm sorry, we did articulate it. We'll talk about it more in depth. Why did Chazal institute a ksuva? Rabbi say, the Gemara says, Kedei shalote kala be'inav lo tzia. What were Chazal concerned about? Chazal were concerned that if divorce was too easy, a man might simply get upset at his wife and what? Summarily divorce her. Remember, Rabbi say, since the whole get process is a little bit, remember, it's not, the power is not equally vested in both parties. Right, the power of the get is certainly shifted towards the husband. So the husband could just summarily divorce his wife. So how did Chazal level the playing field a little bit between husband and wife? Ultimately, a ksuva. Because what a ksuva says is fine, you want to get divorced, okay, but there is a significant financial payout. So therefore, that significant financial payout causes a husband to be a little bit more dispassionate in making his decision. So the Gemara says, therefore, ksuva is there to make a husband think twice about getting divorced. However, in this case, Bahala Mati Matikla. Now, I will say, in this case of the violator, do you need a ksuva? Do you need a ksuva? No. Why? Because the Torah itself says, Lo yucha l'shalcha, that ultimately, again, the violator is never permitted to go ahead and divorce his wife. So therefore, maybe over here, there's no ksuva, but because there's no ksuva, therefore what? There's also no support obligation, to which once again the Gemara says, Tegu. So the Gemara leaves it as an open-ended question. So the Gemara goes weiter. At tehiyas. So remember now we're working our way through the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah pointed out that halacha lamaisa, one of the other clauses in the ksuva, one of the other clauses in the ksuva is that halacha lamaisa, the husband says, if I die and you are a widow, so halacha lamaisa, you can live in my home all the days of your widowhood. So it sounds like from the Mishnah that halacha lamaisa, the widow has the ability to live in the estate up until the time that she gets remarried. So let's analyze this a little bit. So both say really fascinating sugya. So Tani Rav Yosef, bebeisi v'lo bebiksi. You can live in my house, but not my hut. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Right across. We'll say first wide line on Nundal 54a. First wide line, Nundal Aleph, right across in Rashi. Bebeisi v'lo bebiksi. Im yesh lo bayis kofen es hayarshin lo seis la mother lefi kvoda ve'ein yecholin lomar lo lechila beis avicha. But we'll say very interesting halacha. Assuming the husband has a home that is large enough for everyone, the widow has the right to live in the home. And the yisomim, the orphans, because we'll say these cases make most sense if you imagine they are talking about a widow who is not the mother of the orphans. So now, father dies, sons inherit the estate, and there is this woman living with them. Now, granted, the woman is their stepmother, is their father's wife, but not all situations of step parents necessarily work out well. So the idea is like this: I might have thought that the orphans could say, "Listen, thank you, you are a wonderful wife to our father, but we don't want to live together. So you go live in your father's home, go back to your family. We will support you. We'll provide you with support." So what the Mishnah teaches us is that halacha l'maisa, assuming that the home is large enough to accommodate all of them, the yisomim do not have a right to force her out. They don't have a right to tell her that she has to go live somewhere else. However, Rashi says, "Aval ein lo bayis ela biksa ba'alma." Let's say the father did not leave behind a house, but instead a hut. They will say a hut is a bit hyperbolic. What it means is the house is too small for everyone to live in. In that case, the Gemara says, Yecholin lomar lechi me'etzleinu da'at tehiyasva bebeisi kasav lechavalo bebiksi. In that case, the Yisomim can tell her, listen, we're going to support you, but you can't live here. The house is not big enough for all of us. And I will say, the idea over here is that Rav Yosef is darshaning. He says to her, you can live in my house. House by definition means what? A domicile capable of accommodating everyone. But if the domicile is not capable of accommodating everyone, they could tell her, you move out and we'll support you. Ava Mazoni Isla, but they have to support her. Mar Bar Avashi, Omar Filo Mazoni Nami Lesla. This is very interesting. Mar Bar Avashi says, no. If the house is too small and she has to leave, ultimately, again, Rav Mar Bar Avashi says, they're not even obligated to support her. I will say, now, interestingly enough, what's the logic behind that? Sounds like, according to Rav Bar Avashi, the support obligation is a function of living together. Once they can't live together, by definition, there is no longer any support. The Gemara says, furthermore, the less hilchasa kimar bar Avashi, the halacha does not follow Mar bar Avashi, and even in a situation where, let's say, the house is not big enough to accommodate all of them, and therefore she's going to move, they still have an obligation to support her. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. Interesting case here. Tavo alino saving his paisa. Ein la mazonos. What's his interesting case? So let's say Reuven is married to Rachel. And Reuven dies. Sinabah says, what's happening? Assuming the house is large enough, so Rachel is living in the house. Rachel's also being supported by the estate. Now, let's say Rachel gets a marriage proposal. Right? So Tavolina says she gets a marriage proposal, call it from Shimon. Then it's Paisa, and she accepts. So what's the halacha? Ein la mazonos. I will say, once she accepts a marriage proposal, halacha lamaisa, support ends. But I will say, now what's the logic? Rashi points out over here, because remember again, the lashon of the clause in the ksuva is you will live in my home, kol yemei megar alminosayich, all the days of your widowhood. So the idea the Gemara is saying is, once she accepts a marriage proposal, then what? Her widowhood has effectively come to an end. Now, what's interesting about this is, it sounds like the acceptance of the marriage proposal, even without formal erusin. The idea is that she has accepted a marriage proposal that by definition ends the widowhood and therefore ends the support as well. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Halonis Baisa, Yesh Mazonos, which sounds like if she didn't accept the marriage proposal, she still has Mazonos. Amra Ravanan said, Shmuel, listen to this. Amra Machmas Ploni Bali Yesh Mazonos. I'm sorry, Amra Machmas Ploni Bali Yesh Mazonos. Machmas Bnei Adam She'ena Mehuganin Law Ein La Mazonos. So let's listen to this. This is actually quite fascinating. Ravanan said, I think it's even more than this. If she's receiving marriage proposals, right, and she says, I can't accept. I'm too, right? I still feel too connected to my husband, right? I don't feel it's right. So I will say, if she's declining marriage proposals because of her husband, then in other words, because of her deceased husband, then it's still called that she's in her widowhood and she still receives support. But if halacha l'maisa, she's declining marriage proposals, why? Because Mr. Right number 2 has still not come onto the scene. That shows that her widowhood is effectively over and mazonos is terminated. In other words, I will say, essentially what Ravanan is saying is, if she's dating, right, wonderful for her, but if she's dating, that seems to be an indication that this chapter of widowhood has come to an end, and therefore, again, mazonos is terminated. Amar Rav Chisda, zinsa eila mazonos. Well, let's listen to this case. Rav Chisda said, what if she committed an act of znus? They will say, now znus is relative over here. What does znus mean in this case? She had relations with a man. They will say, now to be clear, she's not married, right? It's not znus in terms of like punishable znus. The idea is she had an intimate relationship with another man. So they will say, not marriage. Znus ein la mazonos. She no longer has zonos. So we'll say the idea of being intimate with another man indicates to us that what? Her widowhood has come to an end. So Rav Yosef, kichla upirkisa ein la mazonos. I will say if she's applying makeup, kichla upirkisa means she's making herself look attractive. Now, why is a woman making herself look attractive? Ultimately, because she wants to get remarried. Right? They will say, by the way, it's also interesting. You find this fascinating. The idea, like today, if you would ask, like I think if you think it's just how societal norms change, it'd be interesting to see, like if a woman puts on makeup, so a lot of dafka, she's doing it for others. She's doing it for herself. A person wants to feel. So it's just fascinating. I think these are societal things. Bismana Gemara, if a woman is putting on makeup and accessories, she's doing it, and she's not married. If she's married, she's doing it for her husband. If she's not married, she's doing it why? Why? To get married. These societal nuances are fascinating. In any event, if she goes in and she puts on makeup and accessories, in lamazonos, that indicates to us that halacha lamaisa, she has intention to get remarried, and therefore the mazonos obligation ends. So mandamar zinsa kol shkein kichlo birkisa. So the opinion that says zinsa certainly includes getting dressed up, right? Adore accessories and makeup. Mandamar kichlo birkisa. But the one who says that if she starts putting on makeup and accessories, that her mazonos ends, would say, however, aval zinsa isla. Even if she was intimate with another man, halacha lamaisa, she still receives mazonos. My taima, yetzer ansa. Rabbi say yetzer ansa means what? Shed a moment of weakness. Shed a moment of weakness. Which Rabbi say, by the way, what a profound Gemara to learn. In other words, Rachel lost her husband. She's a widow. She had a moment of weakness and she was intimate with another man. Rabbi say, everyone has moments of weakness. So what's interesting about this is, don't let the moment of weakness indicate that her mourning for her husband or her connection to her deceased husband has come to an end. She's still a widow. And she's still living in that widowhood. She had a moment of weakness and ultimately, again, committed an act of znus. But the Maisa says she's still in kol yimei meger almenosayich, which I will say, by the way, is something so fascinating. Because what is the Gemara saying? That you could commit an avera, right? You could have a lapse, but the lapse doesn't remove you from your primary state. So Rachel had a lapse, but the lapse doesn't remove her from her widowhood. I was saying, this is such good news for us. Because what does it tell me? What it tells me is my state, Rabbi say, my state of being is banim atem lashem elokechem. My state of being is that I'm a child of the Ribono Shel Olam. My state of being is that va'atem hadvekim Hashem elokechem. I am davak, I cling to Hashem. My state of being is that I am in love with the Ribono Shel Olam, and I try to always be with Him. But sometimes what happens? Yetzer al bisha. Sometimes I have a lapse. So sometimes we think that the lapse removes me from my primary state. I'm no longer a son of HaKadosh Baruch Hu after my lapse. I no longer have devekas to Hashem after my lapse. But what do you see from here? Not true. A lapse is a lapse, but that's exactly what it is. It's a momentary removal, but it does not go ahead and fully remove me from my primary state. Just like Rachel remains a widow, despite the fact that she was intimate with another man, it was a lapse. Liyesha al b'shah. So too, even when we have our lapses in life, which we all experience, those lapses do not remove us from our primary state of connection to the Ribono Shel Olam. Such an incredible and overwhelming Gemara. So Gemara says, by the way, the Gemara says, the halacha does not follow any of these rulings. Rather, how do we hold? Ela kiha. Tell me if you Shmuel. Hato va'as ksuvas bezdin ein lamazonos. So Rabbi says interesting. Halacha lamaisa. At what point in time does support from the estate come to an end? When she claims her ksuva. Rabbi says halacha lamaisa. When Rachel shows up in Bezdin and she says, "Okay, I want my ksuva." At that point in time, the moment she claims ksuva, Mizonos ends. Rabbi said, obviously, if she gets remarried, of course, Mizonos ends. At the moment of remarriage, the estate would also pay her out her ksuva and she would be done. But the idea is, so we'll say, listen to this case. If a woman sold her ksuva, or she collateralized her ksuva, or she made her ksuva an apotiki. Apotiki means, right, an appointed place of repayment. La'achar, she did this to someone else. In mazonos. So we'll say, in other words, if she did any of these things with her ksuva, she does not have mazonos. Hani in tova'as lo. So we'll say, sounds like only if she did these things with her ksuva, but not if she claimed the ksuva. To which the Gemara says, no. Hani bein bebezdin, bein shelo bebezdin. So the Gemara says, these items, if she utilized her ksuva in any of these ways, in bezdin, outside of bezdin, that effectively ends mazonos. However, tovas bebezdin in shelo bebezdin lo. But if she claims her ksuva, I will say the moment she claims her ksuva, either in bezdin or outside of bezdin, that ends mizonos. So therefore, I will say, halacha l'maisva comes out of here as follows: that if a woman claims, she asks for her payment of her ksuva, whether she asks for that payment in Beis Din or outside of Beis Din, the mizonos obligation comes to an end. That's possibility one. Possibility two: if she uses her ksuva in some type of business transaction, she sells the ksuva, collateralizes the ksuva, uses the ksuva as a form of repayment. Halacha l'maisa, at that point, mizonos obligation ends as well. Let's go weiter. The kachayu anshe yusham. So also remember again, the Mishnah contained an interesting machlokes. What was the machlokes? The machlokes in the Mishnah was as follows. The Mishnah quotes and says that halacha l'maisa, the support obligation, right? The minhag of Yerushalayim and the Galil was that a husband was obligated to, the estate was obligated to support the widow all the days of her widowhood, right? And the estate would just have to bear the support. In Yehuda, they had an interesting phrase. In Yehuda, they would write Achi Yirtzu Hayarshim Litein Ksuvasech. In Yehuda, they had an interesting right that the Yarshim, the inheritors, could choose to pay. They could support her, but they could also choose to terminate support by paying out her ksuva whenever they decided. So an interesting distinction. So again, in Yerushalayim and the Galil, the estate had to support the widow until the widow decided to collect her ksuva or she gets remarried. In Yehuda, power was vested in the heirs, and the heirs could decide at any point in time, we don't want to support you anymore, here's your ksuva, hatzlacha rabba. So says the Gemara, Itma Rav Amar Allah Kanshi Yehuda. Rav says that Allah is like Anshi Yehuda. Ushmuel Amar Halacha Ka'anshe Galil. And Shmuel says, no, the halacha is like Anshe Galil. I both say Galil is Galil and Yerushalayim. Galil. So the Gemara says, Bavel, Bechol Parvada, no Karav. So Bavel and all the surrounding areas conducting themselves like Rav, Narda, Bechol Parvada, no Kushmuel. And I both say Narda, and all the surrounding areas ultimately went ahead and conducted themselves like Shmuel. Good. Says the Gemara, listen to this. So Ahi Bas Mechuza Dahavin Sibel Narda. There was a lady from Mechuza who married a man from Narda. Asul Kamei Rav Nachman. So ultimately, again, they came before Rav Nachman. Shamal Kala de Bas Mechuza. He heard from her accent that she was from Mechuza. Amr Lahu. Bavel v'chol parvada kirav. So apparently Mechuza was an outlying city of Bavel. So Rav Nachman said, Bavel and all of its surrounding areas, paskin like Rav. Amrullah, they said to him, but this lady married a guy from Narda. Amrullahu ihachi Narda v'chol parvada no kishmol. Ultimately, again, Narda and all the surrounding cities ultimately conducted themselves like Shmuel. V'ad heicha Narda. And I'll say, how far does Narda extend? So the Gemara says, ad heicha desagi kabed Narda, up until the area where they used the Nardoin measurements. Okay, so we'll say, so fundamental machlokes in the Mishnah. Again, and I will say, this was just based on locale. So in some places, the support obligation of a widow continued until the widow herself got remarried or demanded her ksuva. That was in Yerushalayim and Galil. In Yehuda, ultimately support of the widow was dependent on the heirs. The heirs could support her as long as they want, but the moment they decided they didn't want to, they had the right to pay out her ksuva, and support ended. Itmar, Rabbi say another interesting halacha. Almana, Rabbi say, now listen to this. We're transitioning now to ksuva. So assuming now the estate is ready to pay out the ksuva of the almana. Rav Amar Shamin Masha Aleha. We'll say this is fascinating. So Amana shows up to Beis Din. Rav says, included in the valuation of the ksuva is the clothing that she's wearing. her clothing is considered to be the property of the estate. So we'll say, if you can imagine, right? So Rachel's married to Ruvain. Ruvain dies. Rachel decides now she wants to strike out on her own. So therefore, again, she demands her ksuva. She comes to Beis Din. She shows up to Beis Din wearing her mink, right, wearing her fur coat. So Beis Din says, okay, Rav says, fine, but that fur coat, by the way, that's the property of the estate. And therefore, that's fine, it's yours, but it's part of the ksuva evaluation. Shmuel says, no, no, clothing belongs to her. Clothing was given to her, and therefore, halacha l'maaseh is not part of the valuation of the estate. The opposite is a locket. Now, say a locket was a worker. Now, this is an interesting arrangement. The locket, was someone who worked for you. You didn't pay him a wage. He lived in his house. He lived in your house. Essentially, you gave him room, board, and clothing. So the Gemara says they held the opposite by the worker. Rav Kahana Masni the Locket. Rav Kahana said, no. The same opinions about whether or not clothing belongs to the individual, belongs to the estate. The same machlokes by a wife is the same machlokes by a worker. Even though we learned in the Mishnah like Shmuel, the halacha still follows Rav. Disnan. Echad hamakdish nechasav, ve'echad hamarches atzmo. But say if a person consecrates his property or a person pledges his value to the Beis Hamikdash, ein lo biksus ishto, velo biksus banav. A person has no rights in the clothing of his wife, right, and not in the clothing of his children. Velo b'tzeva shetzava lishman, or even dies that he died on their behalf. Velo b'sandalim chadashim shalakach lishman, not even with new shoes that he purchased from him but didn't yet give them. So we'll say, what does this indicate? What this indicates is the clothing of a wife belongs to who? To a wife. It's hers. Now we'll say, interestingly enough, this is the position ultimately again of Shmuel, but yet the Gemara says the halacha still follows Rav. Amrli Rav Nachman v'chini achar l'snar masisik avasi de Shmuel amai hilchos akrav. I don't understand. If you just quoted a Mishnah that paskins like Shmuel, why would the halacha be like Rav? Amrli l'chora kishmuel riata ki ma'ayanta ba hilchasa kavase de Rav. Even though at first glance it looks like the halacha follows Shmuel, when you delve a bit more into it, the halacha follows Rav. How so? So the Gemara says, "My taima." What's the reason? Ki akni la adaita la mekam kamei, adaita la mishka la meifak lo akni la. Because they will say again, b'pashtos, when a husband gives his wife something, they will say, why does a husband give his wife something? It's with the understanding that what? That they're going to be married. Right? That's the intention. That's why a husband gives his wife stuff. He doesn't give her stuff with the intention that they're no longer going to be married. And therefore, I'm going to say that is why Shmuel paskins that halacha, that's why Rav paskins that halacha l'maisa, when let's say the estate is settled, in this case the payment of the ksuva, ultimately again part of that payment includes the clothing that she is wearing. And I will say, I'll point out interestingly enough, the Rambam paskins something interesting. The Rambam paskins is in Hilchos Ishos. Perek Tazayin Halacha Daled. The Rambam says, "V'cheineskinu shekishetavo ligbos ksuvas achamoso." Good. He goes on. He says, "V'shamin la masha aleha." Incredible. The Rambam paskins that Halacha L'maisa, what she comes wearing to Beis Din, ultimately again is included in the ksuva settlement. So Halacha L'maisa, even the clothing on her back, ultimately again becomes part of the ksuva settlement. The Gemara goes weiter. Kalsa devei Rabbi Yashav hava katava ksuvas miyasmi. So I will say the daughter-in-law, or a daughter-in-law of the house of Bar Al Yashiv wanted to collect her ksuva from the estate. In other words, the widow wanted to collect her ksuva from the estate. So what happens? So the Gemara says, hava kamati lehu lebeidina. So the widow was taking the orphans to Beis Din. Amar Amri, so the sons, the inheritors said, Zila lan milsa de tisili hachi. So the Gemara says, Azla levishtinu v'achsetinu lekule mana. Listen to this. So the orphans said to the widow, fine, we'll come into the Beis Din, but do me a favor. We are a chashava family. Make sure to come dressed very nicely to Beis Din. They said, come dressed very nicely. So the widow said, fine. She went ahead and she dressed up very nicely, right? She put on all of her nice clothing. The Damra Almana Shamin Ma Shala. So ultimately, again, it's fine. But ultimately, again, they came up for Ravina. Ravina said, by the way, Paskin like Rav. Again, I will say, this was a case, it sounds like the backstory was that the Yisomim felt that the widow was taking a certain advantage of the estate, and they wanted the Beis Din to see all the stuff that she has. So she came wearing all of her nice adornments, and Ravina said, wonderful, beautiful, we're going to give you your ksuva, but understand those items are part of the ksuva settlement as well. The Gemara goes weiter. So, Hahu to Amr Lahu, Nidunya Libras. Supposed to listen to this. Hahu to Amr Lahu, Nidunya Libras. Ultimately, I will say, here's the case. A man goes ahead and says, now Rashi says, this is the Shchid Meira, a man who's on his deathbed. And he wants to go ahead and give a certain dowry to his daughter. Look at Rashi, second to last line Rashi. But it's like a man established a certain amount of items for Nedunya, for property, for dowry for his daughter. He's on his deathbed, he's establishing dowry. What's talacha? Zol Nedunya. I will say, let's say again, the Nedunya depreciates, so the Gemara says it becomes cheaper. Amravidi bar Avin, Purna liyasmi. Ultimately, again, any profits go to the Yisum. In other words, we'll say, let's say halacha l'maisa. So let's say the father said, I want to give items A, B, C, D, and E to my daughter. And we'll say, let's say the price of the value of those items go down. So on one hand, we could say, maybe what the father was guaranteeing was what? The value of the items. Value of the items. So now that the item is appreciated, you have to give her more for a dowry. To which the Gemara says, no. What we look at, I will say, is the father wanted to give her those things. Even though those items depreciated in value, you give her those things. The idea is any type of swing in profit remains with the estate. Ha'ud Amr Lahu. Similarly, again, a man says about his daughter, Amr Bezer will say, Ha'ud Amr Lahu, Arba Mea Zuze Min Chamra Libras. A man says, I want to give 400 zuz worth of wine to my daughter. This was the dowry, right? 400 zuz worth of wine to my daughter. So, Iyaker Chamra. I will say, now what happened? I will say, so let's say for argument's sake, at the time that he said it, let's say 400 zuz worth of wine was 100 barrels. And then what happened? Iyaker Chamra. Wine goes up in value. So now again, it's only 80 barrels. So what's that? Rav Yosef, Rav Chaliyasmi. Ultimately, we'll say, so again, remember, the idea here always is any change in status, the profit always goes to the estate. Krevei Rabbi Yochanan, Havelu Isas Abba, Dava Kamafsa Damazoni. Both a very interesting case over here. Relatives of Rabbi Yochanan, had literally again a wife of their father, which means again, so relatives of Rabbi Yochanan had a widow living in their home, right? So the father died, the widow is living in the house. Listen to this. Apparently, she ate a lot. So she is burning through mizonos like no one's business. Right? So we'll say, so what's going on over here? So Asula Kamei Rabbi Yochanan. So they come upon Rabbi Yochanan. Amr Lahu. So Rabbi Yochanan says like this. Aizul va'amru leilavuch. And I will say now, I want to point out over here. What's happening over here is the father's still alive. In other words, here's the interesting case. It sounds like they're the kids, right? So we'll call Reuven's married to Rachel, right? Reuven's got his sons. The sons are looking like Rachel, and she is like a mizono tsunami over here, right? So she's blowing through the estate. So the problem is the kids, not that anyone wants to think about the demise of their parent, but, right, one day the kids are going to inherit the estate. At this rate, Rachel is literally eating through their inheritance. So we'll say, so the shaila just is, do they have a mechanism? So let's listen to this. So they come before Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan says, listen, Amr Luhu, Eizlu v'amru l'avuchon, diniyached luhu ara l'mizona. Go tell your father that your father should tell his wife, this field is for your mizonos. This field is for your mizonos. In other words, be miyached property for her mizonos. So now, what does that do? Well, what's the benefit of that? The benefit of that says, listen, Rachel, do whatever you want. You want to eat this field clean, eat it clean. But Lamaisa, this is what you have. Your mizon, right? Your mizonos obligation is tethered or is rooted in this field. Fine. So we'll say, sounds like a pretty good eitzah. So by the way, so after they got this psak, which seems to address their issue, so I will say, essentially what Rabbi Yochanan was saying is, you could remove the mazonos lien from the property and essentially vest from the general, what's called, remove the mazonos lien from what? From the estate and vest it in one parcel. So they came and they told Reish Lakish of this great Eitz Rabbi Yochanan. So Amaluhu Kol Shekin Shuri B'Lamazonos. No. What you know what your father just did? He didn't remove the lien from the estate. He actually just added on another source of mizonos for her. Amrulei v'har Rabbi Yochanan lo amar hachi. So he said to Reish Lakish, excuse me. I say, right? It's a funny conversation. Reish Lakish, I mean, I know you're a great Rav and everything, but you know Rabbi Yochanan didn't say this. Rabbi Yochanan argued. So listen to this. Amar lahu zilu havala. You better give her all the mizonos you want. V'ilo, and if you do not, I'm going to remove Rabbi Yochanan from your ears, which Rashi says is an expression of excommunication. Right? I am right, Rabbi Yochanan is wrong, and if you try to conduct yourself like Rabbi Yochanan, I will have you excommunicated. So Asla came to Rabbi Yochanan. So I'll say they came back to Rabbi Yochanan. They're like, you're not going to believe what just happened. Reish Lakish paskined against you, and he threatened us that if we paskin like you, he's going to excommunicate us. Amar lahu ma'asa shekenegdi chaluk alai. What can I do? Ultimately, again, Reish Lakish is as great as I am. He's arguing on me, and I listen. You got to listen to him. Some Rabbi Avo. So I'll say, now I'll point out to Rabbi say that. But by the way, what's the machlokes over here? What's the machlokes? Rabbi said, if I'm not the machlokes, is like this. Rabbi Yochanan clearly feels that although halach lamaisa, mizonos is an obligation on the estate, like any other obligation on the estate, you could choose to go ahead and connect that obligation to a particular parcel. I will say no different, by the way, that if halach lamaisa, a man has an obligation of ksuva, the ksuva devolves upon the entire estate. If a husband says to his wife, he makes a particular field in apoteki, now she has to agree to it, right? And that field, that's your ksuva, if she accepts it, it works. Rabbi Yochanan is going to say the same thing should work for mizonos. Reish Lakish argues. Reish Lakish says, no. The obligation of mizonos is an all-encompassing obligation, and you cannot remove it from the estate and vest it on one particular parcel. So both say, the Gemara ends off by saying, Am Rabbi Avo, l'didimi parshadei minei Rabbi Yochanan, Amar lemizonos ribala. The Gemara said, lemizonos ribala, lemizonos Amar mizonos. I'm sorry, lemizonos ribala. So the Gemara said, ribala mizonos. Shabbos say, if halacha l'maisa, Shabbos say, at the end of the day, Rabbi Yochanan says like this, it all depends on how you phrase it. If a husband says to his wife, this field is going to be for you, limizonos is providing her with an extra source for her mizonos. Bimizonos, however, if he says, this field is for you, bimizonos, what does bimizonos mean? Bimizonos means for your, right? Limizonos means for your ksuva. Bimizonos means in your ksuva obligation. What it means is bimizonos is a limitation. This field for you is bimizonos, then ultimately cuts. I will say that's how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam says that if he says this field is limizonos, then he's giving her an extra source of collection. Bimizonos, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, he's going ahead and he's limiting her collection from this particular field. I will say, Hadrin Allah Nara Mazel Tov. We have another minute. Let's begin the next parak. Another minute. Even though we learned that halacha, actually, I will say, we'll stop here. Good. We began the Mishnah. We'll stop here. We'll say Mazel Tov. And by the way, don't worry. We'll say you can see tomorrow is a very short daf. We are right back on track. Baruch Hashem. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, everyone have a wonderful, wonderful day. Shkoyach.